dollars are actually worth more. In real terms, a dollar can be, just a bank account, can be your best performing investment in a deflationary world. If you have 2% deflation, then the real value of a savings account with zero interest goes up 2%. And that's probably better than what stocks are doing in that world. So people act rationally. They say, okay, we have negative rates. Central bank must be worried about deflation. If they're worried, I'm worried. And I'm going to save more because, first of all, those savings will do well in deflation. I need to be prepared for that. The last thing I want to do is spend. If prices are going down, why would I spend? I'll wait 6 months, get a cheaper price. So in other words, real world behavior is the exact opposite of what central bankers predict. Central bankers predict, use it or lose it, you'll go spend the money because I'm going to take it away. But real people say, no, I'm going to save more because you're signaling to me that the value of the money is going up because you're worried about deflation. The prices are coming down, so what's the rush? So for all those reasons, negative rates don't work. Now, in theory, cutting rates from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 down to 0 does perhaps have some stimulative effect, not as much as people think. And so the Fed says, well, we don't want to start with 0. If we start with 0, if that's our target, and negative doesn't work, and the economy goes into a recession, how do we stimulate the economy? We can't go below 0, but we can't cut rates because we're at 0. So they believe that they ought to keep rates around 2%. Now, as inflation is about 2%, interest rates are about 2%. And that gives you 2 points of cuts. You could do, in 25 basis point rate cuts, you could do 8 cuts. It's a full year of rate cuts from 2 to 1 3/4, 1.5, 1 1/4, et cetera. You could do 8 25 basis point rate cuts with 2%. So the Fed says our target rate is 2% because we need a little cushion in case we have to cut. And if we're at 0, we don't have a cushion, we can't cut. That's what they say. The reality is the following. And the way I explain this, it's like a little kid, like a 9-year-old kid, and his mother leaves her purse around. And the kid goes in the purse and sees there's $50 in the purse. And he says, well, even an 8-year-old will say, well, if I steal the $50, mom's going to catch me and I'm going to be in trouble. But if I take a couple bucks, she won't notice. Like, she's not counting the dollars every day. And the Fed's idea is if I steal 2% from you, you won't notice. 10%, yeah, you'll be up in arms. You'll be driving tractors up the steps of the Fed the way they did in 1980. But 2%, you kind of won't notice. Well, what's the math of 2%? Well, 2% cuts the value of the dollar in half in 35 years. It cuts it in half again in another 35 years. Bear in mind, you're starting from down half. So in a typical lifetime of 70 years, at 2%, the dollar is going to lose 75% of its purchasing power. So in 70 years, typical lifetime, your dollar loses 75% of its purchasing power at 2%. And that's really the point. Because 2% year in, year out, probably not enough to feel, but it's insidious. And by doing it for a long enough period of time, you destroy the purchasing power of the dollar. And that's what they really want to do. Why? Because the federal debt is nominal. The debt is nominal. If I owe you $1, I owe you $1. Whether in real terms it's $1.05 or 95 cents, that's separate, but I owe you the buck. Well, if you can destroy the purchasing power of the dollar, you're actually reducing the real value of the debt. People say America has never defaulted on its debt. Well, first of all, that's not true. It's not a true statement. But the easiest, quietest, stealthiest way to default is inflation. It's like, hey, here's your $1 billion back. Good luck buying a loaf of bread because I've destroyed the value of the dollar. Now, 3% will do it in about 23 years, which means that you'll destroy 75% of the purchasing power in 46 years, not 70 years. So on, 4%, 5%, et cetera. At 10%, you cut the value of the dollar in half in 7 years. People like to bang the table and say, since the creation of the Fed in 1913, the dollar has lost 95% of its purchasing power. Well, that's a true statement, but you don't need 110 years. We lost 50% in 5 years. Between 1977 and 1982. So inflation is insidious. It is a tax. It is a form of theft. But like the kid with the mother's wallet, if you keep the theft, in small little bites, but do it long enough, you can get the whole thing and no one will notice. So they say we want 2% because we want to be able to cut if we have to. But the real reason is we want to basically erode the value of the debt and erode the purchasing power of the dollar in ways that you don't notice. And they can be very patient. That's how they do it. So now back to the BRICS. They've replicated the World Bank. They've replicated the IMF. Now they're coming out with a new currency. BRICS currency. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. And I tell people, I said, if you want to understand this, it took me a long time to figure this out. I was just like slaving over it. But I said, if you want to understand this, you have to stop thinking like an American. You have to start thinking like a Russian. This is the kind of thing that pretty much only Russia could come up with. So what is the BRICS currency? And by the way, I don't know if they're going to call it a brick. I'm saying brick for convenience. It doesn't matter what they call it, but I just call it a brick for the time being. But they'll come up with a name. Who knows? The value of the brick is not determined with reference to any other currency. It's determined with reference to gold by weight of gold. And I don't know the weight. They'll pick one. But again, it doesn't matter because now we're back to Aristotle's transitive law. This is the key. This unlocks the whole thing because Aristotle said, if A equals B equals C, then A equals C. The B can drop out. It's not even arithmetic. It's logic. It's called the transitive law. I'm certain that Aristotle invented it. If any Greek scholars know an earlier source, let me know. So what the BRICS have done is they have dodged the biggest bullet, the thing that caused Bretton Woods ultimately to fail, the thing that potentially stands in the way of all this. They've defined their currency by weight of gold. Now, a weight of gold has a dollar value, right? So A equals B equals C. One brick equals one, could be an ounce or a kilo, it doesn't matter. You call it an ounce. One brick equals 1 ounce of gold equals, today, 1970. Well, through the transitive law, drop out the B and one brick equals 1970, $1,970. But that's constant. I mean, that logic works for a moment in time, but it's not fixed because the price of gold is going to fluctuate daily, minute by minute, right? So what's going to happen is the dollar gold, call it exchange rate, the dollar price of gold. So the LBMA, the COMEX, the London Metals Exchange, JP Morgan, unallocated forward contracts, the whole huge gold market in dollars is still going to exist. In fact, the BRICS want it to exist. And if I could just digress for 1 minute, I've never seen an international monetary economic problem that has created more confusion. I won't say misinformation, that's a little trite, but just confusion or maybe deliberate hyperbole than this one. Because let me tell you what this is not. I'm going to tell you what it is, but it's important to know what it's not. This is not the petro yuan. This is not the petro ruble. This is not a gold-backed yuan. This is not a gold standard. This is not the end of the US dollar. It's not the end of the euro. It's not the end of the world. It's not any of those things, but that's what everyone's running around on websites or whatever shouting about. It's none of those things. In fact, quite the opposite. And this is where the Russian mentality comes in. The BRICS want the dollar to be around. They want the dollar gold market to exist because they get the free ride. The dollar has to do all the dirty work in the gold space, and BRICS get the free ride. By declaring one brick equal to a weight of gold, again, weight's the key, they just let the dollar gold market go wherever it goes, and the brick is worth an ounce or whatever, kilo, whatever. And the dollar equivalent under the transitive law changes, but they're not pegged to the dollar. They're not fighting that fight. In other words, the BRICS get to free ride on the dollar gold system. And they want that system. They don't want it to go away because they get the benefit of a gold value. Now think of what the BRICS don't have to do in this scenario. They don't have to buy gold. They don't even have to own gold. They do, but no one in the world has enough gold to back a currency. This currency, the BRIC, will not be redeemable into gold. Now maybe there's a dealer somewhere who will take it. That's between you and the dealer. But it's not like you're going to be able to march down to the People's Bank of China with a pile of bricks and say, give me the gold. They're not going to do it. So it's not redeemable. They're not going to make a market. They're not going to maintain a value because they don't have to, because it's by weight. They just get to sit back and piggyback on the dollar gold system and let the dollar do all the dirty work with one twist. And here's the Russian contribution. So you don't have to close your capital account. You can close it, open it, whatever. You don't have to buy gold. You don't have to make a market. You don't even need that much gold. You just say, this is the ultimate fiat currency. The word fiat in Latin means I say so. Well, they say so, and there it is. Basically, this is a bet. This is a bet that the dollar is going to collapse against gold over time. I think that's a very good bet. This is not a 3-month forecast. I'm not saying gold's going to go up or down the next week. Who knows? But over time, now we're into what? Debt to GDP ratios, annual deficits, dare I say, modern monetary theory. I mean, all these ideas are ruining the dollar, and everyone can see it, but not yet. And so if you want to launch this new currency and you say, hey, long term, the dollar is going to collapse in terms of gold, I'll hook my horse to this wagon called gold by weight, and I'll just reap the benefits. And I don't have to do a thing. And so that you're defining it by weight. So the dollar gold market goes where it goes, but you don't really have to worry about it because you're anchored to weight. But here's the twist, and this is how it's going to play out. Now you're the United States. So you're like, looks like I've been painted into a corner. What can I do? Well, one of the things you could do, I've told the Treasury this for years, they don't listen. I mean, they invite me in, but they don't listen. One of the things you could do is buy gold. But what happens when the United States buys gold? The dollar price of gold goes up and the brick gets stronger and the dollar gets weaker. Checkmate. In other words, the US is now in a box where you can't even get out of it by buying gold, because you're going to weaken your own currency relative to gold in the process, and the BRICS are just going to sit there and not lift a finger. So it's genius. I got to credit the Russians. I'm not saying the Chinese couldn't think of something like this, but this has got Russia's fingerprints all over it. Okay, people have been talking about this for 20 years. You know, the Great Reset, the end of the dollar, the collapse of the dollar, gold to the moon, et cetera. And it's never played out. And the reason are some of the ones, which is the dollar has these huge embedded advantages in the form of its reserve currency status, not because everyone loves the dollar or they even love the United States, but because we have the only bond market big enough to absorb global savings. The U.S. Treasury market is huge. It is liquid, but it's got a whole infrastructure. Primary dealers that bid at auction, when issue trading, settlement, clearance, futures hedging, options hedging, depository trust corporation, settlement, on and on and on. It's got this huge infrastructure of laws, rules, and regulations that they've been building for a long time. I would say 37 years since Alexander Hamilton. But above all, it has the rule of law that people just trust it. Don't have to like the dollar, don't have to like the United States, but you trust the market. The U.S., in response to the war in Ukraine, broke the trust. They froze the U.S. Treasury assets of the Central Bank of Russia. Unprecedented. And I'm a sanctions expert. I work for the intelligence community. It was part of what I did was, look at sanctions and CFIUS and a lot else. And as far as I'm concerned, I know that our BRICS friends agree, that's a default. Maybe S&P would call it a selective default, but Russia made the money. They bought the treasuries. They're entitled to principal and interest. And we're saying, no, you can't have the principal and interest. We're not paying you. Well, that's a default. I don't care how Janet Yellen wants to dress it up. And it was a shock. But worse than that, everyone else in the world was watching. Saudi Arabia, India, Brazil, Malaysia, and they're saying, and Turkey and others, and they're saying to themselves, what if the United States doesn't like what I did? What if they don't like my policy? Are they going to freeze my treasuries? Well, until a year ago, you would say, well, of course not. They would never do that. Well, they did in the case of Russia, and they will potentially in the case of these other countries. So that was the catalyst. The idea of getting out from under the dollar, yeah, it's been around a long time. The feasibility of that was limited, capped really by the absence of a bond market big enough to absorb global savings. But now the countries are saying, well, what good is it to have my savings in treasuries if you're just going to steal them? So I'm not saying BRICS are wonderful out of the gate, but at least it's not dollars. At least it's not maintained on a digital ledger at the U.S. Treasury, and at least you can't steal it. And so that was the catalyst that drove this thing from a 17-year project to, hey, warp speed, let's get it done. How do we do it? And there we are. China doesn't have any of that. None of it. There's no significant Chinese bond market. They don't have the infrastructure of banks and dealers I described. They don't have the physical infrastructure. And most of all, they don't have a rule of law. You can't trust the Chinese as far as you can throw them. I was a facilitator and then a participant in the first ever financial war game ever conducted by the Pentagon. We did this at a top secret location called the Warfare Analysis Laboratory. One of the things we did there, I was on the China team. I wanted to make it realistic. So I said, let's lie, cheat, and steal, because that's what Wall Street does. And that's a more realistic game. So I recruited a friend of mine who's fluent in Russian to be on the Russian team. And I had dinner with him before we went down to the laboratory. And I said, look, here's the plan. I'm going to persuade my China team colleagues to basically announce a new gold standard. And we've accumulated enough gold, and we're going to say, for now on, our currency is backed by gold. We're going to put the gold in Switzerland to keep everybody happy. We're going to issue notes from a bank created in London under English laws to keep everybody happy. Here's the thing. We're going to say, from now on, if you want our exports, you have to pay for us in this new currency. We're not taking dollars anymore. And furthermore, and if you want some of this new currency, you can deposit your gold in Switzerland and the bank will issue you some currency, so you're in the system. Or you can trade with us and run a surplus, and then we'll pay you in the currency and you can use that to buy our stuff, or we'll give you loans. But one way or another, we're done with the dollar. And obviously this is very forward leaning, but the whole idea of a war game is to help the Pentagon think 5 or 10 years ahead. So the first thing that happened when you go to your embassy or conclave, you come out and you stand up at the podium, you announce your plans, and then everybody reacts and it's discussed, et cetera. The first thing that happened is there was a group. So we had the red team, the yellow team, the blue team, as the case may be, and they're all different countries or areas. But there's a white team, which are the referees. They decide what you did. And the first thing they did when we announced the gold move, they ruled it as an illegal move. They said, no, that's not in any of our scenarios. You can't do that. And I stood up, and about 100 people in the room. There were 3-star generals, CIA, FBI. I said, wait a minute. I said, this is a war. There are no illegal moves in a war. The whole idea is to be out of the box or live in a world where there are no boxes. That's what we're doing here. So they agreed. They said, okay, we think it's a really dumb idea, but we'll let you do it. Well, over the course of 2 days, it accelerated and gathered momentum. At the end of it, Russia got PowerPoints. Okay, so this was 2009. Within 10 years, so what facts happened? Within 10 years, Russia tripled its gold reserves. Last week, the dollar value of Russia's gold exceeded the dollar value of its treasury securities. They have 20% of their reserves in gold, and the value of their gold is more than the value of the U.S. treasury securities. They're dumping treasuries, buying gold. Exactly what we warned the Pentagon about 10 years ago. And here it is, and China has more than tripled its reserves. So we're not there yet, but we're moving to some kind of gold-backed world. But the point is, that was all in the war game. That's all in the book. And I made one other point. I said, currency wars don't happen all the time. They might only happen twice in a century. But when they happen, they can last for 10 or 15 years. That's how long it takes to sort out. What you describe about the Chinese money supply is absolutely correct. People in the United States complain, the Federal Reserve has printed $4 trillion in the past year. And they have printed $4 trillion in the last year. They're taking the Fed balance sheet from about 3.5 trillion to 7.5 trillion. So yeah, we printed $4 trillion in the past year. Didn't do any good, won't do any good, but we did it. But Chinese money supply is even larger and growing faster. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds on China's internal monetary policy. I could, except to say that they're grossly over-leveraged. The economy is investment-driven, not consumption-driven. They're about 45% investment. The U.S. is about 25% investment. So that gives you some idea of how investment is to the Chinese, which is actually okay if you're investing in productive assets that pay their way. They're not. They're wasting the money. I've been to China many times, been going back and forth there for 35 years. I've been out in the countryside. I don't just stick to the hotel lobby in Beijing. I got mud on my boots visiting these ghost cities. And so each ghost city, there are a bunch of them, actually seven. Imagine building 7 cities. That's what I saw. And so they got 1 or 2 skyscrapers, and they got mixed use, and they got retail shopping, a country club, a hotel, a golf course, a pond, highway stops, airport, etc. And it's all empty. I mean, it's just all empty. Shiny new construction, some of it still under construction, all empty. So I said to the communists, I said, what are you guys doing here? I mean, nobody's here. So, oh, don't worry. People will be coming from the countryside. And they will be populating these cities. And I said, when? I said, no one's coming. And besides that, you've already drained the countryside. That already happened. But I said, you cannot mothball a building. It's not like some old clothes. I mean, the way a building maintains itself, it gets occupied and there's maintenance and people fix it and all that. I visited, I used to travel a lot in Central Africa in the early 80s. It was Zaire at the time. Today it's the Congo. I was in Kinshasa, but it was right after the 70s commodities boom. And they took the money, of course they wasted it, and they built these skyscrapers in Kinshasa, which is like a swampy, scary, funky, city. But there's a skyscraper, but the windows are falling out and there were rust stains running down the side and the elevators were broken. So it might have looked nice the day they built it, but it was never really used. And now it was literally, when I was there, it wasn't that much later after they built it, it was falling apart. So that's going to happen in China. My point being, if you apply, generally accepted accounting principles to their investment account, you would write it off the day they open the building because nobody's there. It's not worth anything. So they're wasting the money. They're over leveraged. They're overprinted. However, none of that has anything to do with the status of the Chinese yuan as a global reserve currency. The yuan is not a reserve currency. It will not be probably in my lifetime, maybe never. And I'll tell you why. Because a lot of people don't understand what a reserve currency really is. You get a report from the IMF and it says, 60% of global reserves are in dollars, which is true, and about 25% are in euros, which is true. So 85% of global reserves are in dollars or euro, which means the only meaningful exchange rate in the world is the euro-US dollar cross rate. Everything else is working around the edges. You got some sterling and yen and Swiss francs and a couple other things. Aussie dollar is tiny, believe it or not, good currency, but not a big part of it. And China's like this kind of invisible 1% sliced down at the bottom. And China has $1.4 trillion in its reserves. But here's the point. It's not as if they have pallets of $100 bills stacked up in the basement of the People's Bank of China. They don't. You invest in securities. In other words, they're dollar-denominated securities. So it's not actually dollars. They're treasury bills, notes, and bonds denominated in dollars. So the thing that makes a reserve currency is not the currency, it's the bond market. You need something to invest in. Again, so you need a liquid bond market with different maturities, different interest rates. You need dealers, you need auctions, you need payment and clearance systems, you need repo or repurchase agreements, futures, options, when issued trading, custodians, the rule of law. There's a whole massive infrastructure, which we started working on when Alexander Hamilton was, advising George Washington, and we've been doing it ever since. And others, Bank of England has done the same. China doesn't have any of that, none of it. There's no significant Chinese bond market. They don't have the infrastructure of banks and dealers I described. They don't have the physical infrastructure. And most of all, they don't have a rule of law. You can't trust the Chinese as far as you can throw them. And so they have no chance of being a global reserve currency, none. Same with the Russian ruble, same with a lot of other currencies, same with Bitcoin. Show me the Bitcoin bond market. Maybe you can get my attention, but not sooner. So none of those are going to replace the dollar. First thing, my wife hates me to admit this, but I was once a registered lobbyist in Washington. I ran an office there. I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill. And the first thing I learned in Washington is you can't beat something with nothing. In other words, if you hate a policy or a program, you just hate it, you write op-eds, fine. You're not going to change it unless you bring something to replace it. So for all the criticisms of the dollar, and there are plenty of them, you're not going to dethrone the dollar as the leading global reserve currency unless you can show me what you're going to replace it with. And there's one and only one contender in the world today, which is gold. So that's a whole other conversation. I'm not saying we're going to be on a gold standard tomorrow. As far as China's concerned, China's a house of cards. It's going to collapse. It's going to be ugly. Hard to say when, but probably sooner than later. And they know it. And they're not going to be a global reserve currency. So we can put China to one side, but China's a house of cards. Now, getting it back to the United States, the first point, let's talk about stimulus first. So the Fed printed $4 trillion. Congress, we had $1 trillion, what are called baseline budget deficits going into the pandemic. So with no pandemic, we were going to have $1 trillion deficit in 2020 and 2021. Now, Congress put $3 trillion on top of that with rescue and bailout programs last March, April, and May. That was the CARES program, payroll protection plan, aid to hospitals, extended unemployment benefits, higher unemployment benefits, et cetera. And I'm not saying any of those things were bad. It was needed to keep things from getting a lot worse. But we put $3 trillion on top of this. So there's $4 trillion for fiscal 2020. They just did $1 trillion last week in the kind of final days of the Trump administration. So that's $5 trillion. And Biden has announced his plan. He's going to have a $2 trillion rescue bailout, so-called stimulus plan now. So that's $7 trillion plus the $1 trillion baseline for fiscal 2021. So there's $8 trillion in deficit spending in 2 fiscal years, $4 trillion of money printing by the Fed. Now, those are the numbers. That's not projections. That's baked in the pie. Just don't call it stimulus. It will have no stimulative effect. Does it, again, as I say, keep the lights on? Yes. Would just some people keep their jobs last spring because their employer got payroll protection plans? Yes. Did other people benefit from increased unemployment benefits? Yes. Was a lot of that necessary because things were in such bad shape? Yes. So I'm not arguing that side of it, but it does not stimulate. It's not going to get us out of the depression. Let me be very specific as to why, because I don't make claims without backing it up. On the money supply, you can print all the money you want, but Milton Friedman was wrong. The monetarists are wrong. The Austrian school is wrong. Money printing does not cause inflation. What causes inflation is something called velocity, which is the turnover of money. The money has to be lent and spent. Banks have to be lenders. People and businesses have to be borrowers. You have to be spending it, get it in circulation, in other words, in order potentially to have some inflation. And that's the technical name for that is velocity. Velocity is dropping, sinking like a stone. By the way, it's been dropping since 1998. It dropped faster in the 2008 crisis. It's dropping faster today, but the trend has been very steeply down for the last 22 years. And so, nominal GDP, so the dollar value of all goods and services, leaving aside inflation, that's what we mean by nominal value. Nominal value of gross domestic product is money supply times velocity. How much money is there and how much does it turn over? Multiply one by the other, and that's your nominal GDP. And I remind people that $7 trillion times zero is zero, meaning you can print the $7 trillion, but if you don't have any velocity, you don't have an economy. And so you can understand monetary policy is a desperate race between increasing money supply and declining velocity. One offsets the other so that you barely keep nominal GDP where it is. In fact, it's going to go down about 6 or 7%. We're not getting back to 2019 levels of output. If you take 2019 as your baseline, we're not getting back to 2019 levels till 2023 at the earliest. We're not getting back to 2019 levels of job creation, the number of people who have jobs, until 2025 at the earliest. That's why I call it a depression, not a recession. Now flip over to fiscal policies. Like, hey, they're sending everybody $2,000 checks, and they are. The people are going to get those checks. And so the Wall Street, which usually gets things wrong. That's the first thing you got to know about Wall Street, because they don't really care about you. They care about rap fees and how they make money. So they're saying, all right, they're going to send out the $2,000 checks, and people are going to get those checks, and they're going to run right out. And they're going to buy a car, a refrigerator, paint the kitchen, whatever it may be. No, the first two things are true. They're going to spend the money, and they're going to borrow the money, and they're going to send people the checks. But when people get the checks, they're not spending it. What they're doing, they're saving it. They're either paying down debt, which is equivalent to savings, or they're putting the money in the bank, which is savings. So certainly if you lost your job, you're not going to take your friends out to dinner. You're going to throw the money in the bank or pay the rent. But even if you didn't lose your job, you look around, like maybe your spouse lost his job. Maybe your neighbor lost his job. Maybe you think you're next, like you have a job, but you're worried you're going to get fired next week. So you save it. And the name for that, economists call that precautionary savings, or, plain English, it's saving for a rainy day, except it's raining everywhere. So they are going to send the checks out, but people aren't going to spend it. And that's the reason you're not going to get the stimulative effect. But you are going to increase the deficit, which gets back to this debt to GDP ratio. So take the total debt divided by GDP, and that's some ratio. The research is very convincing, very clear. A number of studies show this, that up to about 90%, so 90% debt to GDP, you get a little bit of something called a Keynesian multiplier, meaning you borrow $1, you spend $1, and you get $1.10 of GDP, or you get $1.05 of GDP. And it works maybe temporarily, but it works when people won't spend the money, the government can. That's the idea. But when the debt to GDP ratio goes above 90%, that's what physicists call a critical threshold, or a phase transition. Now you're through the looking glass. Now the Keynesian multiplier drops below 1, meaning you borrow $1, you spend $1, but you only get 90 cents of GDP. But meanwhile, the debt went up $1. So what's happening to the debt to GDP ratio? This is going up dollar for dollar, but this is going up 90 cents on the dollar. So the ratio is getting worse. Guess what the U.S. debt to GDP ratio is today? The answer is it's about 135%. So we're way past that 90% threshold. And by the way, who's in that club? I can tell you, Lebanon, Greece, and Italy. So there's your lunch table for four, the four super debtors league. And it just gets worse. And that ratio past 90% is a headwind to growth, because people look at it and are like, hey, I don't have a PhD in economics, but I just don't like what I see. And people understand correctly, and this is the behavioral adaptation that policymakers on Wall Street do not understand. But the behavioral adaptation is people look at it and say, I don't know how this is going to end, but it's going to end. We're either going to have a default, or we're going to have something like hyperinflation to make the debt go away, or they're going to raise my taxes. Not sure which, maybe all of the above, but I have to save more money to meet my lifetime goals in the face of some bad outcome that's going to come out of this. That's the real world behavior, and economists know very little about the real world. So the point is, increasing the money supply doesn't work because velocity is declining. Increasing deficits doesn't work because people are saving, not spending, and they're preparing for worse outcomes. So neither one of these, you can call it money printing or spending, but don't call it stimulus, because it doesn't stimulate. We're not getting out of this. And that's why I call my book The New Great Depression. If you look at yield curves, look at the Treasury yield curve, Euro dollar futures yield curve, German Bunds yield curve, they're all inverted. They're all inverted. Now, inversions happen, just meaning the longer term rate is lower than the short term rate. We're seeing something globally we've never seen before. And it is the best single indicator of a recession. The last time we saw anything like this was in 2007, just ahead of the 2008 financial catastrophe. So the stock market's saying it's all good, Goldilocks, soft landing, Fed's going to get the memo, they're going to cut rates, the pivot, and buy stocks. The bond market is saying no, this is bad and it's going to get worse, and it's actually too late for the Fed to do anything about it. See, when these inversions start, sometimes they're a year forward, like, hey, look at the Eurodollar futures yield curve a year from now, man, that thing is inverted. But what happens is, as you get closer to the actual thing you're worried about, the inversion gets nearer and nearer. Now it is literally a month away or less. So that's like a big red siren, flashing light, whatever you want to call it. Okay, whatever your baseline is, probably treasuries, 2-year notes or 5-year notes or whatever, they will come down a lot. Not right away. We may still be a month or two away on this, but they'll come down a lot. And then corporate yields will go up a lot because of the recession, because of deterioration, increased bankruptcies, reduced revenues, et cetera. So those spreads will blow out. And it's important to remember, interest rates are a lagging indicator. Everyone's like, well, how could interest rates be going up if we're in a recession? The answer is, as you get closer to recession, who figures it out first? Well, the Fed figures it out last. They're usually the last to know. Wall Street is second last to know. The people who figure it out first are actual business people, entrepreneurs, restaurant owners, dry cleaners, taxi drivers, or even medium-sized businesses. They see it. If you're in the trucking business, it's real time. If inventories are sky high and new orders are being slashed, you're not moving anything by truck. So there are certain businesses that are concurrent. The yield curves I was talking about are very good forward indicators. They tell you what's going to happen next. A lot of business people are living in the real world in real time. They know what's happening now, and the stock market tends to figure it out later. But as far as banking and credit is concerned, what happens is, if you're a business person and you see business heading down, fewer customers, whatever, you go out and borrow all you can. You're like, hey, there's a really bad recession coming. If I got lines of credit, I'm going to use them up now. I don't want my bank changing the terms. I said, I'm going to borrow everything I can. And that creates a demand for funds, and interest rates go up. And then the recession hits, and the bankers go, what's going on? Credit losses start going up. And then they just turn off the spigots and they raise standards, they stop doing loans. And then interest rates will start to come down. Interest rates peak after the recession has already begun. So interest rates may not have peaked yet. Even the treasury market. So that's not unusual. Now, here's what the Fed is missing, or maybe everybody's missing. When you hear these layoff announcements, people are like, well, if they're laying off, why isn't the unemployment rate going up? Well, the answer is they have to announce the layoffs. There's all kinds of statute, SEC. So if I'm going to fire 10,000 people, I got to tell the world I'm firing 10,000 people. It doesn't mean, and it kind of goes like this. Yeah, the Fed's tightening. We see that. Inflation is going to come down really fast. The economy is going to slow down really fast. Both of those things are happening. Inflation, a little less so, but the economic slowdown is there. And the Fed's going to get the wake-up call and have to cut rates And cutting rates, that's the pivot. They're going to pivot from rate hikes to rate cuts. And that's good for tech stocks, so buy stocks. Now, that's the narrative. There are two huge fallacies in that narrative. The first one is who says the Fed's going to get the message? And if you look at what Jay Powell said and what he repeated, we're going to raise rates. We're going to crush inflation. I've been following this for 50 years. I've never seen a Fed chairman use the word pain 3 times in one paragraph, but he did, and he meant it. He knows there's going to be a recession. They're causing it in part. Unemployment's going to go up. He said that. He tied unemployment to killing, basically demand destruction and getting inflation under control. He said, that's how we're going to do it. And you're already starting to see some early signs of that. So with that as their focus, who says the Fed's going to, get a wake-up call? Almost certainly not. I mean, they told us what they're going to do. They're going to raise rates. And then he said, if we see progress on inflation, we'll pause. But pause doesn't mean cut. It means just wait a long time, because at that point, core PCE, that's personal consumption expenditure, core, which excludes oil and food, and that's just how they do it. That's their favorite metric. You can debate whether it's the best one, but the debate doesn't matter because that is the one they use. Let's say that comes down to around 3.5. Okay, it's still not 2. Now, what Powell, which is their target, so what Powell said is, we don't have to keep raising rates to force it to 2. We just have to raise them enough that it'll get to 2 on its own. That's what they call restrictive policy. So, but that's not a rate cut. He said that might last for a year, all the way into 2024. That's when he was talking about rate cuts. Now, again, this can change, but they've told us what they're going to do. I always say, forecasting the Fed's the easiest thing I do, because they actually tell you what you're going to do, what they're going to do. You just have to listen and believe them. Now, the hard part is understanding how badly they're going to destroy the economy and when they're going to get the wake-up call. That's the hard part of the analysis. But telling you what they're going to do is the easy part, because they kind of tell you. So the stock market notion that somehow they'll be cutting rates is just false. But the second fallacy is even bigger: is tell me why it's a buy signal for stocks if the Fed is throwing the economy into such a bad recession that unemployment is going to go up significantly and growth is going to come down, inflation is going to come down. Why is that a buy signal for stocks? Bear market rallies are really interesting. Some of the biggest rallies in history have been in the middle of bear markets, where you ended up losing everything, but for a couple of days or weeks even, it's the bottom's in, you buy stocks, et cetera. So you have to watch out for that. So my expectation is the recession's coming. It's going to be really bad. Inflation is going to come down fast, but not quite fast enough for the Fed. They're going to keep raising rates, destroying demand, raising unemployment, and we're going to wake up with a severe recession, high unemployment, and a much lower stock market. I was around for the 2008 financial crisis. I was around for 1998 financial crisis. I negotiated that bailout for LTCM. 98 was interesting because it was an acute financial crisis that came very close, within hours, actually. And I was in the room with the Treasury and Italian finance ministry and 19 banks and a thundering herd of lawyers trying to save the world. But we came within hours of shutting every market in the world. There was a $4 billion all cash. You couldn't use the word due diligence because there wasn't time. It was just, hey, the Fed wants us to do this, so let's just do it. So that worked. But it was a very close call. They would have shut down Tokyo and then around the world, London and finally New York. And they would have opened days later. But that's how, with trillions of dollars of losses, it would have been worse than what actually happened in 2008. It didn't happen, but there was no economic recession at the time. That confuses a lot of people because, and particularly if you're using 2008 as a frame of reference. There are financial panics and financial crises and liquidity crises, and there are recessions, some of which are severe. But they're two different things. 98 was an acute financial crisis with no recession. 2000 was a mild recession, but there was no severe financial crisis. Now, NASDAQ collapsed, but there wasn't a lot of leverage in NASDAQ. There was no contagion there, but it didn't spread because no banks failed, no major brokerages failed, et cetera. So in 1990, a mild recession, but no financial panic. October 19, 1987, interesting, stock market fell 22% in one day. Not a week or a month, but one day, down 22%. And that was a financial crisis, but there was no recession. So they're separate things. However, they can happen together. And 2008 was an example. There we had both. But I would encourage analysts to separate those two things. Again, they came together. It was horrific, but they can happen separately. My point is, we may have a very bad recession, possibly worse than 2008. But 2008 is a model, and that may be what we're heading for, bearing in mind that these are two separate vectors. I'm going to spend $50 billion to create 51% of the mining capacity in the world, and I'm going to steal all the Bitcoin in the world and take down the Western financial system. First of all, there's no such thing as cryptocurrency. There are 1,000 cryptocurrencies. In other words, you cannot speak generically about cryptocurrencies. Jim Rickards hates cryptocurrencies. That's not true. I really, really dislike Bitcoin, and I'll tell you why. But there are cryptocurrencies out there that I think are very interesting and worth your consideration. I'm for it. I'm against it. Cryptocurrency means nothing. You have to talk about the specific currency. And I'm showing Bitcoin, Litecoin, Monero, and Ether. By the way, isn't it fascinating how the graphical representation of cryptocurrencies is always a gold or silver coin? Bitcoin's gold and Litecoin's silver, Monero's both, and Ether is gold. I mean, what are they trying to say? I think that psychologically what they're saying is, well, this is nothing, but if we pretend it's a gold coin, then someone will buy it. But I just find this a little bit of an aside. But no, it's the same thing is true with fiat currencies. You can't be like or dislike fiat currencies generically. Some people do because they just hate central banks. I understand that. But it's a big difference between a Venezuelan bolivar and a euro. Big difference between a Zimbabwe dollar and a U.S. dollar. So in other words, don't talk to me about cryptocurrencies. Tell me what specific one you want to talk about, and that's a more interesting conversation. I think it's really important because this field is so muddied, the conversation is so muddied, people not distinguishing between blockchain and currency, not distinguishing between different types of currencies, et cetera. I think we need to step back, take a deep breath, and be rigorous in our analysis and think about what we're actually talking about. There's no such thing as a blockchain. There are hundreds of blockchains. In other words, every currency, every token, every so-called smart contract, if you're using Ether, has a different blockchain. So there are at least hundreds, perhaps thousands of blockchains, new ones being created every day. So again, don't talk to me about blockchain. Tell me which specific blockchain you're talking about, because they're not all the same, and this is critical. The main difference, there are many differences in this blockchain technology, but the main difference is validation. Because remember, the whole idea of cryptocurrencies and blockchain and the original Bitcoin and what Satoshi Nakamoto came up with is that we're going to have a trustless system. We're not going to trust banks. We're not going to trust clearinghouses. We're not going to trust exchanges. We're not going to trust central banks. We're not going to trust anybody. We're going to have a decentralized system that a community can validate, and we don't have to rely on anybody in particular. That was the original idea. So the question is, what's your method of validation? And that's what distinguishes one blockchain from the other. So I've listed 4 of them here, but there are others. Proof of work, that's what blockchain uses. And you know what the work is? You got to factor these, 87-digit prime numbers into prime factors. It's a lot of computer crunching, completely clunky, completely inefficient, non-sustainable. I'll talk about that in a second, but that's Bitcoin. There's something else called proof of stake, meaning this is what Ether is based on. You demonstrate that you have a certain percentage of the processing power, so you step up based on your stake. There's proof of space. Space is storage space on a hard drive, so I get to vote on the blockchain. I get to vote on validating the blockchain because I've decided to devote a certain amount of my hard drive to that process. There's a new coin called Space Mint. And then there's the Byzantine Agreement, or Byzantine Agreement. There's a version of that called the Federated Byzantine Agreement, which I personally think is the best, much more robust to some of the problems we're talking about, and there are others. But the point is, don't talk about blockchain. Say, okay, what's your governance model? What's your validation model?
et cetera, and then ask yourself, is that sustainable? Is that robust? Will that resist an attack? Are your cryptocurrencies going to be stolen? These are the questions you have to ask yourself, and there are no generic answers. So I cannot emphasize enough. Coin by coin, I hate to use the word coin, whatever, token by token, blockchain by blockchain, be rigorous and ask yourself what's sustainable. Now, Bitcoin, Ripple, and Ether, and some of these other cryptocurrencies, not all of them, but the best known are going to fail. When I say fail, they're going to, Bitcoin might have a $200 value as a token for criminals. I think criminals and terrorists might find a use case at about $200 per Bitcoin, but they're basically not going to be anywhere near where they are today. Why do I say that? I don't want to make a claim without backing it up. The first point is they're non-scalable. Transaction times are slow, and then when you say that to Bitcoin people, they go, aha, the Lightning Network is right around the corner. Lightning's going to, we'll see. They said that about segregated witness. They said that about some of these other solutions. They don't seem to get community support. They keep forking the Bitcoin, meaning one day you wake up and there's 2 blockchains instead of 1, or whatever happened to that whole idea that we weren't going to have inflation and we weren't going to pull new cryptos out of thin air. But these solutions, you have to understand what the solution is. So what they're saying is nobody has a solution for the inherent slowness, clunkiness, non-scalability of the original Bitcoin blockchain. There's no solution for that. So when you hear about solutions, what are they? Well, what they're saying is take a bunch of transactions offline. So everybody in the room could form a group, or let's say every coffee shop in Brooklyn, New York, every coffee shop in Vancouver could form a group. And all the people who want to buy coffee would join that group. And we would agree, so we're in our own little bubble over here, and we would agree that all of our Bitcoin transactions among each other don't go on the blockchain. They just get settled in this sort of separate cloud over here, and then we net them out. So, I pay you 5 Bitcoin, and you pay the person next to you 4, and he pays the lady in the back of the room 10, and she pays me 7, and we net it out, and then periodically, and it could be daily, weekly, monthly, or whatever, we net all this stuff out, and then we take that net and we put that on the blockchain, so that the amount of transactions that have to go on the blockchain is greatly reduced. That's true. But what are we doing? We've created our own network. I got to trust the coffee shops. How do I know they're not going to steal my money? In other words, it's only a solution because you're completely negating the original idea. Well, sure, if you want to tear up the original idea and start over, that's fine, but don't tell me you're adhering to the idea of a decentralized trustless network, because you're not. All you've done is create another network. Somebody, I get trolled on Twitter all the time. People tell me I'm an idiot and I don't know technology and all that stuff. And then my more sour moods, I tell them I was coding before they were born. But as far as some of these things are concerned, somebody said, well, you don't understand payment channels, and I actually do. And I said, yeah, I understand payment channels. We had those in the 50s. They were called party lines, which is, you pick up the phone and someone's talking. You got to ask them to get off the phone so you could go. In other words, there was an AT&T network, at least in the United States, but other people could jump in on this little side thing. That's all it is. These are party lines. So that doesn't work. Non-sustainable. The energy usage to solve the problem and make the proof of work in Bitcoin is now greater than the annual energy output of Ireland. Imagine taking all the electricity used in Ireland in a year, and that's how much we have to use to crunch numbers. By the way, every applied mathematician will tell you that prime factoring is a trivial problem. It's like an uninteresting problem. But it takes a lot of computing power to do it because the numbers are so big and the possibilities are so great. So we're just wasting the entire electrical usage of Ireland. In a few years, it's going to be the entire electrical usage of Japan. Who in this room thinks that governments are going to allow Bitcoin miners to use as much electricity in a year as the entire country of Japan, the 3rd largest economy in the world? That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It's not very green. It's completely wasteful. In other words, it can't happen. So that's why I say it's non-sustainable. It's going to hit a wall. Non-regulated, I don't have to remind you of all the frauds, new ones popping up every day. And it's not just exchanges. Exchanges are, how do exchanges work? Well, I want to go to a Bitcoin exchange. Well, you got to go in, you got to open an account, just like Merrill Lynch or Charles Schwab, right? So, or Toronto Dominion. So you go, you give me your name, your address, your social security number, your bank wire information, give them all that information, and then send them dollars, and they say, okay, you got some Bitcoin, here's your confirmation. Really? How do I know you didn't just take my dollars and send me a phony baloney confirmation? How do I know you're not, a Ponzi? You're using new money to pay off the old money. How do I know you're not Bernie Madoff with a computer engineering degree? How do I know you're not a bucket shop? How do I know any of those things? The answer is you don't. So good luck with that. Not to mention Bitcoin whales. They estimate there are 1,000 people who control 40% of the Bitcoin. Now you got millennials buying, 1/100th of a Bitcoin for, $10 or whatever the math is, $100. But you got these, I call them the whales, these 1,000 people who have 40% of all the Bitcoin. You don't think they have a big vested interest in keeping the price up? And you don't think they wash trade, do wash sales? So A sells to B for 10,000, B sells back for 11,000, A sells back for 12,000, B sells back for 13,000. This is called painting the tape. It's the oldest trick in the book. And there's no profit and loss because we're selling the same Bitcoin back and forth. But what we are doing is creating a ticker that gets the millennials, I shouldn't pick up millennials, 3 millennial children, but gets people all over the world, maybe a garage mechanic in South Korea took out a home equity loan or hawked his inventory, put his entire life savings into Bitcoin and has now been wiped out and is desperate and suicidal. That's what's going on. It's basically rich people stealing from the poor. Not a good business model, in my view. And then finally, there's no use case other than criminals, terrorists, or tax evaders. Why is Bitcoin better than Visa unless you're a criminal? Now, if you're a criminal, I get it. If you're buying child pornography, you want to use the dark web and use some cryptos and all that. And if you try doing that with Visa, you'll probably get a call from the FBI. So I understand why it's good for criminals. But if you're not a criminal, if you're not a tax evader, if you're not buying child pornography, if you're not an arms dealer, if you're not a terrorist, then why is Bitcoin better than Visa? There's really no use case for it other than crime. And then it's not elastic. And this is important because there's a finite number of Bitcoins, 21 million Bitcoin. They're getting closer to that level every day. And everyone's like, this is a good thing because, the problem with central banks is they print all this money and we're going to have inflation. By the way, we haven't had any inflation for the last 8 years. Separate issue. I'll come to that if we don't run out of time. But, we hate central banks. They print too much money, blah, blah, blah. So we're going to cap the number of Bitcoin. But money supply has to be elastic. It can't be too elastic. The problem with central bank money is that it's too elastic. The reason, by the way, gold is such a good form of money is that it grows slowly. It grows at about the tempo of world growth. It grows at about the tempo of population growth. Not exactly, but close enough that it's the best form of money anyone's ever discovered. But the problem with Bitcoin, when you hit a hard stop, which they will, and the economy keeps growing, but you want to back it with Bitcoin, so here's your money supply and here's your economy, that's inherently deflationary, right? Because each Bitcoin's got to support more and more growth, meaning your Bitcoin is worth more in theory, but the problem is you never get there. Why? Because if you have a deflationary currency, there's no bond market. The money supply grows based on credit, based on loans, based on various forms of borrowing. The money supply is just a foundation, and the economy grows with credit. Nobody wants to borrow in a form of money that's going to be more expensive when you pay it back. I'm not talking about interest. That's always part of the equation. But I'm saying the money itself is worth more when you have to pay back the loan. No one's going to borrow on that loan, therefore no bond market, therefore no viable form of money. So these are all the reasons why this is going to hit the wall.
So a couple of things. We should probably, without taking too much for granted, we should probably just define BRICS. It's an acronym: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So those are the BRICS. And started in 2002 as a Goldman Sachs marketing gimmick. Jim O'Neill and some partners came up with it. And all they did, I'm not diminishing what they did, but they kind of took the leading economies, took out the G7 and Switzerland and a couple of obvious leaders, and said, well, who's left? That will be the up-and-comers, the fastest-growing developing economies. Then they got Brazil, Russia, India, and China. That was kind of easy. And then a few years later, they added South Africa, which was a little bit of a favor to South Africa. South Africa is not anywhere near as large as those other economies or as important. However, it is one of the biggest economies in Africa. And if you're going to be the BRICS, you probably can't just be South America and Asia. You probably need to include an African country. So they picked South Africa. So for a couple of years, it was a Goldman marketing brochure. But then in 2006, at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, annual meetings, heads of state and foreign ministers show up from all over the world, but they have what they call these bilateral meetings on the sidelines. And sometimes there are 3 or 4 say, hey, we're all here, let's just grab a conference room and sit down and talk. Well, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, they sat down and they said, yeah, we actually have a lot in common, a lot to talk about. And we added up, we're a pretty powerful group. So they formalized it. And then in 2009, they had a summit conference, a formal summit conference with an agenda and all that in Yekaterinburg in Russia, in the Russian Federation. And they solidified, okay, we're a group, we're going to work together. And they did. And over the coming years, they multiplied numerous. People say it's the BRICS meeting. They have about 190 meetings a year. They have working groups on women's rights, sports, the environment, climate change. It could go on and on. It's a very active, what they call secretariat, which is central organization. A few years later, in 2014, they formed what they call the New Development Bank, NDB. Well, what's the New Development Bank? First of all, it's got 100 billion of capital, part paid in, part callable, but it also has borrowing power with that kind of ownership and that kind of capital on the balance sheet. They've got hundreds of billions of dollars of borrowing power. They could easily get a pretty good credit rating. And the purpose is to make loans for development projects to the member countries. And by the way, there are stockholders of the New Development Bank who are not BRICS, but they're kind of in the club. Well, what does that sound like? The World Bank on their own terms with their own governance. Okay, the following year, they created something called the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. Well, what's that? Again, they threw in a couple $100 billion from the members. China was the biggest contributor. Again, with borrowing power, so take a couple $100 billion times 5 or 10, that's your power. And this institution was designed to be a swing lender to members who were running trade deficits or facing a run on their currency or facing the prospect of having to close the capital account. Exactly what we saw in 1997, 98, by the way. I was there for that one. We ended up with long-term capital. Well, a pool that is a swing lender to countries with balance of payments deficit, what does that sound like? That's the IMF. So basically, they copied the World Bank, they copied the IMF. And I want to make 2 points. Number one, it's not like the BRICS popped up 6 months ago and said, hey, we're going to have a new currency. It's like Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland putting on a play. This has been in the works for 17 years. And it's typical Russian, Chinese. They're very methodical. So they've duplicated the World Bank. They've duplicated the IMF. Now they have applicants for membership. And there are, I think, 21 or more countries who have applied, 7 have formally applied for membership. They filled out their college essay and they want to be members. And then another 13 or 14 on the waiting list, so to speak, and will perhaps eventually become members. But when you add those in, some of these will be admitted, starting with Saudi Arabia. Okay, so what happens when you let Saudi Arabia into the BRICS, given the other members? You have 2 of the 3 largest oil producers in the world, Russia and Saudi Arabia. You have 2 of the 3 largest nuclear arsenals in the world, Russia and China. You have, throwing India in and some others, you have about 50% of global population, 54% of global GDP using purchasing power parity. You can debate the method, but just if you do purchasing power parity, you get over half of GDP, 30% of the global landmass. I could go on and on. My point is, I learned development economics in the 1970s. We had something called the third world. It was Russia or, Soviet Union and the US. And then there was the third world. And all you knew about them was they were poor and, you had to get them off the runway. We actually had the runway theory of how you'd grow. Turned out to be wrong, but that's what we learned. Well, this is not the old third world. These are not basket cases. These are many of the biggest economies in the world that collectively have enormous power, natural resources, gold reserves, landmass, population, military, and again, I could go down the list, but this is a bloc that is as powerful in its own way by a lot of these metrics as the collective West, which I would call US, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a few others. So that's who this group is. Now, there are a couple other groups that may join forces with the BRICS. There's something called the Eurasian Economic Union. Everyone's like, what the heck is that? Well, this goes back to the early 2000s. This was Putin's answer to the EU. He said, well, you got the EU, we got the EEU. Now it's Russia and some Central Asian republics, some, Belarus and Tajikistan. I'm not saying this is France, Germany, and Italy, but it is a group that have reduced tariffs and improved trade between themselves. And there's another powerful group called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, led by China. And these are mostly Central Asian republics, including Kazakhstan and some others. But they're all talking to each other. Now, what's the common denominator? Well, it's basically Russia and China. China's a member of two. Russia's the only country in the world that's a member of all three. So through pretty simple inference, you can say, hey, Russia and China are running the show. And it's very likely that when this thing plays out, and I'll talk about the thing, I realize we're glossing over that, but when this new currency plays out, that those other countries will join in. When you do that, and I found a really cool widget. It's a map of the world that's blank, and you can go country by country and fill in by color. Just click on it and give it a color. And I did that. And I was like, okay, here's the BRICS, it's 5 countries or whatever. Well, here are the applicants, it has another 20. And here's the SCO, a few more. Some of them are members of both. Here's the EEU, has a few more. Again, many are members of both. And you keep going. And all of a sudden, like a light bulb goes on. I said, that is Halford Mackinder's global island, what he called the world island. And this goes back early 20th century, first, probably greatest geopolitical theorist in history. Got to read his book if you haven't read it. It's pretty short. But he had this idea of the world island. That is exactly what they're building. Now, why is that important other than the obvious, which is more collective economic and population power? By the way, output of wheat, pick your metric. This dominates the world. Well, for one thing, if you're going to have a currency union, the more countries you have, the more likely you are to be successful. Let's just kind of digress for a second. And what are the headlines saying? China and Saudi Arabia are talking about selling oil for yuan. Brazil and China do large multi-currency deal where they accept each other's currency. UAE, China, same thing, selling oil for yuan. Russia, China, using yuan and rubles as payment methods for whatever they sell to each other. Russia sells natural resources, China sells semiconductors, manufactured goods, and so forth. And there are a number of those. I don't have to list them all, but there are 10 or 15 of these. The reason they've all fallen short, and very few of them have actually come to fruition despite the headlines, is when you have two countries and they're going to trade with each other and accept each other's currency, and you can do that, you're limited to what you can do with that currency. This is why the Russia-India thing is starting to break down. Russia's been pumping oil to India. India's been paying in rupees, but how much curry do you need? And Russia's starting to balk. They're like, hey, we're up to our eyeballs in rupees. We need a better system. Well, when you have a multilateral, multi-country currency union, that problem goes away. Now, Russia sells oil to China. China pays in BRICS, the BRIC currency, pays you in BRIC. But Russia can take the BRIC and turn around to Argentina and say, we'd like to buy, or Brazil maybe, and we'd like to buy some Embraer aircraft. And Brazil gets the BRIC currency, and they can turn around to China and say, we'd like to buy some rice. And then China takes, et cetera. And so you've solved the quasi-barter problem. A couple of things. Number one, I would increase my allocation to cash. I'll stick with cash, but let me kind of put that in a context. The most powerful investment tool we have is diversification. Problem is people don't understand what diversification means. So I run into people all the time. They say, well, I'm completely diversified. I own 50 different stocks in 10 different sectors, semiconductors, consumer non-durables, minerals, et cetera. And I say, you're not diversified. You may own 50 stocks in 10 sectors, but you have one asset class, stocks, which are subject to conditional correlation. In calm markets, they're idiosyncratic, but in panics, they all go down together, or in bubbles, they all go up together. So you're not diversified. So what is diversification? Diversification is having slices of asset classes that are minimally correlated. It's probably not zero, but as close to zero as you can get. So what would that be? You'd have a slice of gold, but I recommend 10%. And I have some strong views on gold, and I've written a lot about it, but people are surprised to hear me say 10%. Like, oh, Jim, why isn't it 50% or 100% if you believe all this? Well, I do believe it. I wouldn't say it if I didn't, but you don't want to be 100% in anything. You don't want to be 50% in anything. 10% is fine. If I'm wrong, you won't get hurt. And if I'm right, you're going to make so much money that it'll actually kind of be the insurance on the rest of your portfolio. But that leaves 90%. So I would have a large slug in cash, maybe 30%. And people say, well, wait a second. Bank's paying me 25 basis points. Stock market's going up. Why would I want to be in cash? That's horrible. A couple of things. Number one, the stock market might not always go up. Cash is the opposite of leverage. So leverage increases the volatility of the rest of the portfolio. You'll get much bigger returns, but you'll have much bigger losses. If you have a slice of cash and you've got a volatile asset over here, which are stocks, and another volatile asset over here, gold's fairly volatile. If you got that volatility and you have cash, it will reduce the overall volatility so you can sleep better at night. Cash is a great asset in deflation. And if you're talking about inflation, which is here, then you got to deal with that. But don't rule out deflation. If we go into a recession because the Fed over tightens, or, the thing about the inflation, just a quick aside, it comes in two flavors. There's cost push and demand pull. Demand pull is when individuals are worried about inflation and they start accelerating purchases, like, hey, I better go buy that washing machine right now because the price is going up, or better go buy that house right now because the price is going up. That's demand pull. Cost push comes from the supply side, not the demand side. And that's what we're seeing because of what we talked about, supply chain, energy cost. The Fed can't drill for oil. Raising interest rates doesn't get you more oil or natural gas. So the Fed can't do anything about it except kill the economy. Yeah, and that'll cool it off. But when you pay, I put gas in my car. I don't just read about this stuff. It used to be $45. Now it's about $75. Multiply that by 200 million cars across America. What happens is it reduces your discretionary income. If you're paying another $30 at the pump twice a week, then you're not going to go out to dinner Friday night. You're not going to, take a vacation, whatever it may be. So that depresses all those other areas. So there is this recursive function. So don't rule out deflation down the road. Not right away, but maybe next year. So cash. But here's the biggest value of cash. It gives you optionality, and people don't understand this. What if I said to you, "Hey, I'll sell you a call option, an at the market call option on every asset class in the world?" You go, "Gee, that sounds kind of valuable." Well, that's what cash is. When things are crashing, you're the one who can go shopping, and nobody's better at this than Warren Buffett. He's got his cash level at Berkshire Hathaway is at an all-time high. So there's a place for that. You can have some stocks, but I would look at the energy sector. I mean, I actually built and I own the largest non-commercial solar module field in New England. And I run my house off it. It produces about 7.5 kilowatt hours. So I know a little bit about it. And what I know is it doesn't work at night. It doesn't work in snow. It doesn't work in rain. It doesn't work in really cloudy days. By the way, you don't run your house off of solar modules. You run your house off of batteries.
Yeah.
And the modules charge the battery. So you watch the battery level. That's how you manage it. So it works fine. But if you think you can run cities with that, forget it. So it's just not practical at that scale, even if you thought it was. And it isn't. That's very clear. But here comes, wind turbines and solar. And I'm not against it. Like you say, I own one. But they're not scalable. They're intermittent. And they don't give you the base power, the baseline power you need to run a modern power grid. Meanwhile, here's global demand. Okay. So the gap's getting bigger. It's not getting smaller. Renewables, whatever the pros and cons, are not closing the gap. The gap's getting bigger. There is no substitute for oil and natural gas and uranium. You got to put uranium in the mix. And hydro, if you live in Quebec, that's great. A lot of hydro, but not so much in the desert. And I've spoken to, without mentioning names, I would say you can go no higher in terms of who knows, let's just say board members of the 5 biggest oil companies in the world who said, yeah, as he said, we talk about that, but we can't say it publicly because we'll be, dragged, chained and dragged through the streets. But those are just the facts. So therefore, if you have an oil sector that's been bashed by the climate alarmists, but you can't do without it, which is true, buy some oil companies, when they're, so there's your stock portfolio. Private equity, venture, real estate, not commercial, but residential, yes. And, farmland, that's one of the hottest asset categories, and gold. So that's diversification. And that's the kind of portfolio you want, you kind of season to taste. So the question is, will the Fed go down that path, do what they have to do the only thing they can do, to subdue inflation at the cost of a very severe recession and something like a stock market crash?
Or will they see that coming? They'll be the last to know. We'll all see it before they do, but they'll be the last to know. It's because they rely on flood models, and they're kind of in their own economic forecasting bubble, and they're very defective ways of thinking about the economy, and they're very much a creature of inertia. There are a whole lot of reasons why the Fed is not nimble. It's kind of quite the opposite. But they'll see it eventually, probably when it's too late. And will they balk at that point and stop rate hikes and maybe even reduce rates? That could save us from the recession, but that will just amplify the inflation. So rather than say which one's going to happen, I prefer to lay out those two paths and then just watch it very carefully. But more to the point, we've seen this movie before. This is a replay, and I think it's on, like you hit the remote control for double or triple speed. It's going to happen faster, but this is a replay of everything that happened from 2013 to 2019 and into 2020, which was, I'll just go through it quickly. So 2013, May, Bernanke says we're going to taper asset purchases. That's money printing, quantitative easing, whatever you want to call it. The market, tanks, bonds go down. Everyone's like, oh, it's over. Bernanke balked. But finally, in November 2013, they said, okay, the taper begins. They were still printing money, but at a slower rate, and that matters. That went on until late 2014. The taper was over. They stopped buying new assets. They said, okay, here come the interest rate hikes. Except they didn't come for another year. It wasn't until December 2015 that then Janet Yellen finally raised rates. And then another year for the second rate increase. So it was December 2016. So it was really, really slow. Took 2.5 years, but they got to 2 rate hikes. But then here comes Jay Powell, and then like clockwork, boom, 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 25 basis point hikes every meeting. And all the Fed was trying to do was to get back to normal. They were trying to get interest rates to maybe 2.25, 2.5, get the balance sheet down to, something like 2.5 trillion. They never specified it, but that would have been a reasonable level. So, okay, now interest rates are kind of normal, 2.5, balance sheet's down around 2.5 trillion. We're back to normal. We finally got through the global financial crisis of 2008. We undid all that stuff. Well, what happened? From October 1st, 2018 to December 24th, 2018, the stock market dropped 20%. That was the December 24th, 2018, we call it the Christmas Eve massacre. Stock market went down 3% in one day. But the Fed was tightening into the weakness, as they always do. And the last interest rate hike, it was December 16th or 17th, within a day or two, but mid-December 2018, they were still hiking and raising rates. And that was the last straw. And then the market just tanked. And then finally, Jay Powell got that message. First week of January 2019, he says, okay, that's it. We're going to be patient. Use the word patient. It's one of these code words. You have to get the code book out and see what it means. But patient means we won't raise rates again without giving you advance warning so you can get out of your carry trades or whatever. And then he went further, said, looks like we got to cut rates. And they did. And then by early 2020, here comes the pandemic. And then they took rates all the way back to zero. And then they started QE, I don't know, 6, 7, call it what you want. They took the balance sheet to $7.5 trillion after getting it down to $3.5 trillion. So look at that whole sequence from 2013 to early 2020, including the pandemic. What happened? They tapered the asset purchases. They raised rates. They sank the stock market. Then they said, okay, no more rate hikes. Then they cut rates, and then they started QE. And by April 2020, where were we? Zero rates, back down to zero, and the balance sheet was $7.5 trillion after getting down to about $3.5 trillion. So that was a big circle. They ended up back where they started from. But the point being, they failed to normalize. They failed to get rates where they wanted. They failed to get the balance sheet where they wanted. They did sink the stock market. Okay, now 2 years forward, here we are again. What are we doing? They just raised rates at the March meeting. They're going to raise them again in May. And that's the easiest forecast I've ever made. 50 basis points, May 4th. Boom. You can count on it. And they're going to announce, by the way, I don't have a crystal ball. The Fed told us this. I mean, that's the thing about the Fed. They may be wrong, but they're transparently wrong. So they tell you what mistakes they're going to make in advance. So that's the Fed forecasting is actually fairly straightforward because you just have to believe them. So they're going to raise rates again in May, probably 50 basis points. They're going to announce a reduction in the balance sheet. Whether they actually start it in May, they probably will. 100 billion a month reduction in asset purchases. So that's QT, quantitative tightening. In other words, they're running the same playbook, They tried to run, or they started to run in 2013, 2014. They failed the last time. Why do they think they're going to be any more successful this time? Why do they think they can get out of this? And the answer is, pardon me, the answer is they cannot without a recession. They can normalize rates in the balance sheet and they can stop inflation, but not without causing recession and not without causing a stock market crash. So the big question for the next year is, will the Fed do that? And they may. Or will they balk again, at which point you might rescue the market, but the inflation is just going to go wild. That's the debate. But the thing is about framing it that way. You've got two paths, and we'll get signals along the way. We won't be the last to know. The Fed will, but we won't. You'll be able to see this coming.